character. And like I say, you should have read your notes by this point, so you're familiar with that. All I'm going to be discussing are some examples of character and using some film examples to help us sort of grasp how these things work. When we're thinking about character, we're just really asking who is involved with the story, and this could be a human or non-human entity. All that a character needs to do is have the ability to think and make decisions. When we talk about characterization and the presentation of a character, what we're asking is how do we learn about them? So with the film to book analogy or film to short story analogy, in films, a lot of characterization just happens via the medium. You can see their appearance, you can hear their name, you can see how they walk, how they move, how they talk, how they respond to people. And so we sort of understand the personality of that character because we're human beings who interact with other human beings all of the time. But in literature, we get characterization in a different way, right? We can't know those things because we see them. We can only read them. So you can learn about characters through direct characterization. So somebody says, the character has red hair and glasses, or you can learn about them indirectly via how they respond to something or how they react to situations. That also tells you about a character. Now, in addition to your plot organizer, you have two organizers for characters, and the first one of those is traits. We want to think about characters in terms of their name, their appearance, the objects and places associated with them, the actions, their thoughts and speech, which includes when they say it, how they say it, and what they say, and how other characters feel about them, as well as any other important traits. So to give you an example of this, I'm going to use the Disney classic, The Lion King, which is really just Hamlet with animals, but hopefully you're familiar with the story. We can talk about what we're looking for when we're analyzing character. So first of all, you want to think of the name. In this story, you have the two characters on the screen are Simba and Scar, but if you were analyzing this, you would know that he did not start off named Scar. His original name in Swahili actually means soldier, and as slang, it means trash. In contrast, Simba in Swahili means lion, whereas Mufasa, who is, the king at the beginning of the story, his name means king in Swahili. Rafiki, the sort of old wise monkey character, his name means friend in Swahili. So you do, a lot of times those names will be very deliberate to you, and in the case of the story we just read, Hills Like White Elephants, you have a character named the American, and one who's referred to as the American, and one who's referred to as the girl. And then the waitress is referred to as the woman. You would want to think about the rhetorical connotations of those words. You also want to think about their appearance. So you have one character who, there's a very clear who is sort of the dark, evil one, the scraggly, rough around the edges character, and who is the more, wholesome character, and that tells us about them as well. What are the objects and places and themes associated with them? So Scar is associated with the hyenas and the graveyard, and these sort of ulterior motives, for example, and that tells us about him. You also want to think about their thoughts and speech. Oftentimes characters are not authentic. They might be passive-aggressive in the way that they communicate their ideas. And so, for example, you want to think about, what Scar tells Simba versus what he tells Mufasa in the stampede scene, right? Those things are very intentionally motivated to produce a result, but what that tells us about Scar is that he's manipulative and sort of callous, right? And so we're looking at what that tells us about him as a character. You also want to think about their actions and what other characters think and say about them. So at the beginning of this movie, you hear what other people say about Simba, the future king, and then you hear people kind of, being, you can tell that Scar sort of is the black sheep of the family. That tells us about the family dynamic and also what the narrator thinks and says about them. So that's an example from film. Okay, to talk about protagonists and antagonists, I'm going to use a different example from James Cameron's Titanic. We don't use the terms hero and villain in literature because they're really not complete enough. A protagonist is the main character. That's who we're supposed to root for. That's the good guy sometimes, but that's the main character. And then the antagonist is any opponent to the main character. But remember, that doesn't mean it's another character. It could be a number of different things. Now, when you're determining the protagonist, sometimes there might feel like there can be more than one. but you do want to decide who the protagonist is for your purposes and commit to that. So in the example of Titanic, you have two main characters that show up on the poster, right? You have Jack and Rose. Well, which one of them is the protagonist in the story? Who do we root for? Well, both of them. Who do we want? Who are we sympathetic to? Well, both of them. But you want to think a little bit more deeply about what role they play in the film. You could identify either as a protagonist, but for our purposes, the story involves an older woman telling a smaller story that we're seeing, right? So Rose is the protagonist here because she's actually the one telling us the story that happens between Jack and Rose and the Titanic. So we would identify Rose as the protagonist of the situation. So then what's the antagonist to her? Any opposition to her. But remember that conflict is central to narrative, and conventional conflicts correspond to conventional antagonists. So she could be in conflict with another character, with nature, with society, or with herself, or any combination of those things. So as an example, the most obvious, one of the first ways that Rose is in conflict in this film is she's in conflict with her fiancé. Right? He's not a good guy. We don't like him. He's definitely the bad guy in the movie. And so that's a character versus character conflict, in which case we have character as an antagonist. Okay? And then a secondary source of conflict in this movie is the very real problem of the iceberg and the sinking ship, right? And that's an example of nature as an antagonist. That's something outside of herself that she can't really, that she can't control, that is definitely an opposing force. A major opposing force or antagonist in the story. And then you have society as an antagonist as well. Remember that the majority of this, the heart of this film, if you've seen it, is about a love story between the high-class girl who's expected to marry rich and the low-class boy who she falls in love with. And, it's sort of a classic star-crossed lover story, but the social implications of her falling in love with Jack, and dating, a poor person, that's a major plot point in the story as well. And these are all our external conflicts, but let's also think about the internal conflict between, is she an antagonist to herself? And arguably, early on in the story, she absolutely is, when she struggles, about whether or not she should, leave Cal for Jack. That's her being an antagonist to what she actually wants also. Now, let's talk about some terms and character types, and I'll give you some more examples from film to help illustrate this. First of all, let's differentiate between character development and character growth. Development refers to how much we know about a character, how fully developed they are. So they can either be round, which means we know a lot about them. They have a lot of personality traits. So, Jack and Rose, for example, or are they going to be flat? Do we have a dynamic representation of them, or if they're flat, they're going to be more stereotypical? And then character growth, the terms we use for that, are dynamic and static. Dynamic means a character will change over the course of the story, whereas a static character will stay the same. Foil characters are one of the most interesting parts of literature to me. Foil characters at their heart are just opposites. They're two characters that have opposite traits. However, they're interesting because the traits of one foil will tell us about the other characters. So another film example for you is Shrek and Donkey. If you think about it, Shrek is this sort of grumpy, unfriendly, sort of antisocial sort of dude, and Donkey is this happy-go-lucky, joyful, really friendly little guy, and these are foils. And the reason that we look at foils in literature is because the traits of one tell us about the other. So without Donkey there, we may not necessarily be able to recognize the full extent of how antisocial and, get off my swamp Shrek is. But because we have Donkey there as a foil character, it really sort of illustrates the extreme difference between two of them. And that's what foil characters do. They can tell us about each other by virtue of their own traits, because they're opposites. Anti-heroes are very popular types of characters these days, and an anti-hero, remember, is not a villain. An anti-hero is a character that we admire that lacks heroic or admirable traits. super common in today's films. So Jack Sparrow, Harley Quinn, the whole gang in Fast and the Furious. These are characters that are criminals. They've killed people. They lie. They don't have a lot of admirable qualities, with some exceptions, of course, but there are a lot of unadmirable qualities about them, but we still root for them. That's what makes them anti-heroes. They're not good guys, but they're good guys in terms of we want to root for them in the story. And then we also mentioned conventional archetypes. Archetypes are types of characters that appear again and again throughout literature. The most common conventional archetype is the hero archetype. This goes back to, Beowulf and, 12th century writing, essentially. But examples from film for you guys, you got, Harry Potter. The main character in most YA adventure stories would be considered a hero. Hero archetypes exist in things like the Avengers, but they also exist, anytime you have a character going on a journey to save something and ends up also discovering something about themselves, that's hero archetypal classic. You can also have a sidekick archetype. So you'll notice in a lot of films you have like these sort of two side characters that aren't really, they're kind of there for a little bit of comedic relief, and they're, sweet and endearing. They're sidekicks. C-3PO and R2-D2, Timon and Pumbaa. That's an example of a sidekick archetype. You can also have other archetypes, like the innocent, Dorothy from Wizard of Oz or Forrest Gump. These sort of like doe-eyed, naive characters that, we feel a certain way about, that, sort of need protection and are a little bit innocent in the world. And then, the old, wise, helpful character like Gandalf or Yoda or Dumbledore in the case of Harry Potter. You see these characters all the time too, right? This sort of old, wise character that helps the protagonist. And these are just some conventional archetypes, but once you start to notice them, you'll see them everywhere, not only in film, but in literature as well. Now, when it comes to analyzing characters and their function, you have a character guide. And the character guide will help you think about who is the protagonist and the antagonist and what are their most distinctive traits. You also want to think about things like values and outlook. What motivates them? What textual details reveal the most about the character? Do we learn about them directly through somebody telling us about them, or indirectly through how they react? What roles do they serve? Are they foil characters? Are they round? Are they dynamic? Are they archetypes? Are they anti-heroes? And what do other characters help us to realize about the protagonist? Which are we encouraged to sympathize with? And what characters are dynamic? Which characters are round? These are things to think about using your character traits sheet. These are things to think about as you start to analyze character. Remember, your first essay is a character analysis paper. So all of these literary traits are important, and we do have to understand plot in order to understand, they build on each other. But above all, when it comes to your character analysis paper, you want to be thinking about your characters very deeply and thoughtfully and going beyond the very surface level information. And these sort of guides and examples should help you get there. Now,